My mother was my rock, my everything, until she passed away 3 years ago. Her absence left a gaping hole in my heart that I thought I could fill with the love of my wife, Melissa. However, there was one aspect of my mother's life that I wasn't particularly fond of. Her husband, Richard. Richard is my stepdad. They got married about a decade ago, and I must admit he wasn't a terrible father figure. He taught me how to drive, how to do my taxes. I'm mentioning all the good stuff first, so I don't feel too guilty about what I'm about to share. For a while, Melissa's behavior had been somewhat odd. I know I often dwelled on memories of my mom. And according to Melissa, there were days when I appeared to be in a state of melancholy. I don't think it's unreasonable considering the magnitude of such a loss. Richard comes into the picture because one day, I was using Melissa's phone to respond to some work-related messages for her. Nothing sinister. It was like a scene straight out of a movie where she was soaking in the tub and a work-related text popped up. Given my familiarity with her job, I decided to respond, even alerting her that I was doing so. But while I was typing out the reply, another text notification appeared on the screen, and I inadvertently read it. It was from someone named Rick. The message began with "Hey, Millie." That immediately set off alarm bells in my head. You see, I'm the only one who calls Melissa Millie. It's a pet name I came up with when we first started dating. And until now, no one else had ever used it. The fact that this Rick didn't have a last name attached to his contact info raised a red flag for me. I felt a twinge of guilt, but I needed to clear my doubts. So I opened the message thread, and what I saw left me frozen in shock. Rick was apologizing for texting her at that hour, acknowledging that he knew the appropriate times to message her, but he confessed that he couldn't stop thinking about her and so on. As I scrolled through the rest of their conversation, I noticed a lot of deleted messages and a few that were marked as seen once. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized my worst fears were coming true. Melissa was involved with someone else. As you might have guessed from the start of this tale, you probably have an inkling of who this mystery man is. Who was this Rick? Could it be? Yes, it was indeed Richard, my stepfather. That's when I devised a plan to confirm my suspicions. I first sent a message to this Rick asking him to meet me the next day at a specific location in town. I instructed him to sit at a particular table wearing a green shirt. A request he found puzzling at first. I simply told him to comply, hinting that it was a bit of a risky endeavor. I then deleted our message chain to erase any trace of our conversation. The next day, I would confront the man in question unbeknownst to him that it was me he was meeting. I mustered up all the courage I could. I'm not a confrontational person, but given the circumstances, I refused to be made a fool of. The following day, I prepared my best arguments and headed to a public place to confront the scoundrel who was wooing my wife. However, my plan backfired when I arrived at the designated spot only to find a man in a green shirt. Yes, you guessed it right. It was Richard. He looked somewhat uncomfortable, perhaps aware that his actions were wrong, but seemingly indifferent to it all along. I chose to toy with the situation a bit. I bumped into him on the street and casually asked what brought him there. I tried to keep my cool, but I noticed he was perspiring more than usual. He mentioned he was waiting for someone but didn't elaborate further and quickly left the scene. Perhaps he was worried I was going to confront him. Honestly, I'm not sure how I managed to suppress the urge to punch him right then and there. I understand the importance of keeping a level head in such situations, but it was tough. Despite my worst fears, I returned home with a heavy heart. That night, I questioned Melissa about her relationship with Richard. She instantly became uneasy and defensive. She dodged my inquiries, claiming she didn't comprehend what I was getting at. So I laid it out straight. I told her I had suspicions that Richard was seeing someone else. I clarified that I didn't have an issue with it as he too deserved to find happiness. What stung was his lack of trust in me to share this given our close relationship. Instead of suggesting I discuss it with him, Melissa advised me to let it be, stating it was his personal matter. And if he hadn't shared it, it might be due to embarrassment or something similar. So it's better if he keeps it to himself, but I persisted a bit and eventually suggested that she should be the one to ask Richard about his relationship status. I sighed. The web of lies spun in front of me was disheartening. I told myself that if I was going to take a bold step, I needed solid proof. I began to devise a plan involving their phones. Update number 1. Regrettably, my plan worked all too well. After sifting through the fake messages, I discovered that both my wife and stepfather were indeed having an affair right under my nose. Life can be harsh sometimes, and it seemed like it was my turn to face the music. I took screenshots of their conversations and decided to confront them both. I planned a small dinner for the three of us, where I intended to unmask them for the betrayers they were. Those double-crossing snakes. The dinner was tense, with both of them unusually quiet, as if they sensed I knew more than I was letting on. After dessert, I decided to break the ice. All right. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. That statement was enough to elicit some desperate responses. Melissa looked puzzled and evasive, not providing a clear answer, while Richard looked downcast like a child caught doing something wrong. I pressed them for an explanation, but they continued to sidestep the issue for quite some time. It wasn't until I presented the evidence that they finally came clean. Here's a brief rundown of their respective responses. Richard went first, essentially saying, "Look, I'm sorry, buddy. I never intended to hurt you. We're all susceptible to temptation, you know. Sometimes we just tumble into a dark pit. I'm not making this up. Even good people can end up doing terrible things. Nobody could ever take your mother's place." When he brought up my mom, I cut him off, lost my cool, and nearly socked him in the stomach. Melissa intervened, which only fueled my anger further. I'd write down her version now, but I'm afraid I might smash the keyboard from typing so furiously. Her response was more direct, more of a tirade. She started off by talking about how our marriage was on the rocks and how Richard, with his life experience, started helping her with various issues. It began with him offering his perspective, and then it escalated from there. I felt sick to my stomach, but I swallowed it down, not wanting to show any signs of weakness. They started to rationalize their affair and then suggested they could make it up to me, as if such a betrayal could be mended. I lost it and started shouting at them. The whole neighborhood must have heard, because everything went eerily quiet. I've never been this livid before. And if we hadn't cleared the table of cutlery, I fear something serious might have happened. I'm documenting all of this because I know everyone's identities. Amid a flood of tears from all parties involved, we agreed that everyone would leave, leaving me alone in the house that night. I wasn't sure where Melissa ended up, but the thought of her possibly spending the night with Richard made me uneasy. However, considering the circumstances, I didn't think it was entirely likely. Update number 2. Hey, folks. A few weeks have passed since that fateful night, and I have to say, I'm not doing great. This whole ordeal kicked off a rough patch for me. First off, my emotional turmoil was affecting my performance at work, and I nearly lost my job. To make matters worse, the gossip about the affair had spread like wildfire in and outside the office. You see, we live in a small town where any piece of gossip is treated like headline news. A lot of people knew me and my mom, so having this scandal out in the open was a huge embarrassment. I'm sure Melissa and Richard are having a tough time too, but honestly, I couldn't care less. Melissa tried to contact me a couple of times, calling twice in quick succession, but I hung up on her immediately, too angry to talk. After those 2 calls, she didn't attempt to reach out again. Richard, on the other hand, took a different approach, but it wasn't any better. He showed up at my house unannounced, suggesting that I should consider forgiving Melissa. He argued that she was young and impressionable. And if anyone was to blame, it was him. I didn't accept his apology. Instead, I lashed out at him, telling him that he had not only betrayed me, but also disrespected my mother's memory. I told him how much I had respected him and that as far as I was concerned, he could go to hell. This is where he and Melissa deserved to be. He started sobbing, but I couldn't have cared less. All I could think about was how long they'd been carrying on behind my back. The thought of them being a part of my life made my stomach turn. I knew I had to do something before I ended up losing my mind. I reached out to an old friend, Lola. She was the one who had introduced Melissa and me in the first place. And she was just as shocked as I was. She even apologized for bringing Melissa into my life, feeling like she had done me a great disservice. She mentioned that she hadn't spoken to Melissa since the news broke and was unsure if she ever would, despite their close friendship. But then she asked me something interesting about the assets Melissa and I shared. I told her we hadn't signed a prenup because we thought we'd never need one. Looking back, that wasn't the smartest move, was it? Interestingly, it was Melissa who initially suggested we sign one. Now with a divorce looming, I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing considering most of our assets were mine to begin with. I'm not sure how she'll react. Will she be one of those remorseful people who would give me everything just to earn my forgiveness? I guess time will tell. But there's one thing that's been nagging at me, and it's why I continued my conversation with Lola about my living situation. You see, the house that Melissa and I shared actually belongs to her, or rather her family. It was a property owned by her aunt, and they'd allowed us to live there indefinitely. I'm constantly worried that she'll remember this fact and decide to kick me out. I mean, given the circumstances, it would be pretty low of her to leave me homeless. But then again, she did cheat on me, so anything's possible. And who knows? Maybe those recent calls from her were about just that. Update number 3. Hey, folks. Life has to go on. Right? It's all about moving forward, upward, onward. In my case, it's a bit more specific. It's got a name: Colombia. I relocated to Colombia a few months back. And before I delve into my experiences here, I think it's important to share why I made such a drastic move. Remember the whole debacle with my ex-wife and stepdad? Well, after that mess about a year ago, I spiraled into a deep depression. It was the darkest period I've ever experienced. There were moments when I even contemplated the unthinkable, harming myself. But thanks to the unwavering support of my friends and my therapist, I managed to pull through. And as I mentioned, I was dealing with changes and grappling with the lingering grief over my mom's passing. I realized I needed to make some drastic shifts in my life. After a lot of contemplation and a bit of mindfulness practice, I concluded that simply moving to a new place in the same city wouldn't cut it. As I've mentioned, the town was lovely, but small, and everyone knew everyone else. So the idea of moving to another city was floated, and I took it. I relocated to a city nearby for a couple of months, long enough for my new job to provide some valuable connections. One of these was a colleague who introduced me to an international work exchange website. At first, I didn't quite get it. But after some digging, I realized it was a golden opportunity. What am I talking about? Well, it's a platform where folks from all over the globe can work in different countries, immersing themselves in diverse cultures and traditions while being gainfully employed. Initially, the concept seemed a bit youthful and whimsical, but it gradually piqued my interest. There were numerous options: Ukraine, Australia, Egypt, Brazil, Romania. But ultimately, I chose Colombia. Latin America is a region rich in culture. Our southern neighbors, my mom used to say, her words significantly influenced my decision, especially since she had spent a year of her youth living there. And she always said it was one of the most enriching experiences of her life. So I thought, why not give it a shot? Besides, I had secured an online job in the new city, which gave me the flexibility to move around as I pleased as long as I had my laptop and an internet connection. So I decided to take the plunge and started making arrangements to relocate to Colombia. I sold most of my stuff and let go of nearly all my possessions to finance the move. Anything that was a reminder of my marriage, I let go of without a second thought. I chose to go off the grid for a few weeks, cutting off all contact, and ignoring all attempt communication from both Melissa and Richard, who kept trying to reach out. I'm not sure if ghosting is the best approach, but in my case, it was the healthiest option to keep my sanity intact. Eventually, their calls dwindled, but every now and then, I'd notice a missed call from them. Interestingly, they never showed up at my doorstep, not that I would have opened the door if they had. And that's how I embarked on my journey to Colombia. I was a bit melancholic about leaving my previous job, but I also believe that moving to a place so far away with different customs and even a different language could bring about positive changes and open up a world of possibilities. I felt like a fresh start, all set to take on the world. All I needed was a proper introduction to this new world. And guess what? The language barrier wasn't as big a hurdle as I'd anticipated. Thanks to my mom's insistence on me taking Spanish classes in school, I had a decent foundation. Sure, I needed to brush up on it a bit, but within a few months, I was conversational enough to get by, even managed to order groceries in Spanish. My job was an assistant role at a law firm handling calls, managing case files, nothing too complex. Initially, the language was a bit of a challenge, but with the support of my colleagues and the repetitive nature of the conversations, I got the hang of it. Only a handful of people knew about my move, as I'm not big on social media, but I felt the urge to share the massive changes I was going through and how I'd landed in such a beautiful place. Looking ahead, I was excited about the future. I'd managed to leave a lot of baggage behind and now I had a clean slate. All I had to worry about was what tomorrow would bring. I'm a person of value, and no one can take that away from me. Update 4. Hey, folks. I'll level with you. I'd almost forgotten about these updates. I've been so caught up in my new life here in Colombia building a fresh start. But, you know, old ghosts have a way of creeping back and I thought I'd put the whole saga with my ex-wife and former stepdad behind me. But they've resurfaced. Well, the ex-wife to be precise. An old friend filled me in that Melissa, now tangled up in a bunch of financial disputes, has been spreading tales about how her husband abandoned her penniless, while he's off living it up overseas, not giving her what she's due. The funny thing is we never officially divorced. So technically, we're still married. She's been saying I've been ignoring her calls and left her high and dry. The truth is, I distanced myself to avoid causing more harm. And here's the kicker. She's now found religion. Yep, she's become an evangelical or something along those lines, but it's pretty extreme from what I gather. She's turned into one of those judgmental religious types, always pointing fingers at others, acting all holier than thou, despite her own past actions. She's just another one of those folks who believe they can do terrible things and then just say sorry and all is forgiven. And what's worse, she's trying to shame me for something she messed up while I'm just trying to get my life back on track. So what's her game? Well, she's claiming that I should be taking care of her and providing for all her needs despite all the harm she's caused. Sorry, but I'm not falling for that. My friend told me that she's even been saying that we've spoken, and I've hurled insults and personal attacks at her. My buddies have been doing damage control, telling others that she's spinning tales and trying to paint me in a bad light for her own mistakes. It all makes my blood boil. But what really puzzles me is that Richard doesn't feature in any of these stories. I haven't heard from him in a while. He was never big on social media, and since I blocked him, I wasn't expecting to see anything from him, but I did notice recently that he hasn't posted anything in a long time. It's all a bit of a mystery. I thought maybe he'd blocked me, but no. I've had a few people asking me about him for the same reason. I neither worry nor care, though. As for me to say something a bit more positive, I've been doing quite well. As I said, at one point, I started working at a law firm as an assistant. But after a while, things did not go so well. And I ended up working at a supermarket on a pretty heavy schedule. And although the pay was good for a while, the workload was simply just too much for me. Eventually, I was able to work my way up the ladder and even becoming branch manager. Something that surprised many people because of the short time I'd been there. And currently, I'm still there. Going every week with simpler hours and enough time to be able that the single life has suited me just fine out here in Colombia. Of course, I haven't progressed any further in that really honor guard. It's always been casual outings, and with very few people, I've been able to have the freedom to talk as much as I did in my old hometown about my mother's issues. I've been able to overcome them a little, but only a little, as it's a delicate thing. I feel that I failed her in many things, but beyond that, I tried to make an effort every day to make her proud from a distance. Update number 5. Life is full of strange twists and turns. Just a day after my last update, I received news about Richard's death. It's been 3 years since our big fallout. And just yesterday, I was writing about it. Today, a friend informed me that Richard was found dead in Greece. Apparently, he had embarked on his own journey, similar to mine, and had relocated there a while ago, dedicating his life to the sea. I won't pass judgment because, as I said, he did what I did, but it's somewhat ironic. From what I understand, after our conflict, he ended his relationship with Melissa, leaving her in the lurch as well. Rumors are swirling that Melissa not only cheats, but she also ruins the lives of the men she's involved with, and that anyone who gets involved with her will end up fleeing the country. From a certain angle, it's almost funny. But that's not the focus right now. Yes, Richard is gone. His funeral is scheduled for tomorrow. Some of his family members have expressed a desire for me to attend. But they also understand if I choose not to. They know me well enough to realize that it's not my place. Despite his major transgressions, he was a human being like the rest of us. While I can't forgive him for what he did, I can at least consider this chapter closed with his departure from this world. In my therapy sessions, we often discussed resentment and revenge. I transitioned from harboring a deep-seated hatred for those people to adopting a more forgiving stance. I mean, it's not worth staying so angry about it all. Sure, it stings when Melissa badmouths me, but every story has a satisfying conclusion eventually. As for Richard's family, I simply offered my condolences and wished them well in their future endeavors. They reciprocated with apologies, which I found unnecessary as they weren't the ones who wronged me in the first place. Update number 6. Now that the dust has settled and I've got some free time, I can finally sit down and spill the beans on everything that's transpired. Firstly, I should explain my recent silence. My lawyer advised me to keep the details of this situation under wraps until the conclusion of the trial. Now that the verdict is out, I can finally share everything. Melissa can go jump in a lake. She's the most detestable, loathsome, scheming and contentious person I've ever encountered. She even managed the unthinkable. She made me wish her the worst. In essence, our past relationship morphed into a bitter rivalry following the trial. Let me break it down for you now that I finally have the time after a grueling 2 months. The victor finally gets to tell his tale. After Richard's passing, Melissa inherited almost all his assets, thanks to a will he drafted years ago. It seems that during their secret affair, Richard had this peculiar fetish for, quote, being part of her life in ways I wasn't privy to. Like showering her with gifts or accompanying her on errands, always under the guise of spending time with his daughter-in-law. During this period, Richard had the audacity to include Melissa in his will. And guess what? He left her all his assets, thinking it would support her regardless of our marriage's fate. Don't ask me why. A man's mind in the throes of passion can be a chaotic and unpredictable place. The real drama kicked off when I learned about the division of these assets. One of Richard's nephews informed me about everything that would become Melissa's property. To be honest, Richard had quite a bit of wealth to his name. I mean, we're talking about cars, a few houses, an apartment, and even a farm out of state. We all agreed she didn't deserve any of it. Moreover, I was informed that Richard himself had second thoughts about his will, but he let time slip by during his stay in Greece and never got around to revising it. Everyone believed that what he left behind should have been mine, and it stung to think Melissa would just snatch it all up. But there was a twist that could change the game. Just as Richard had procrastinated on changing his will, my failure to sign the divorce papers with Melissa meant in theory I was entitled to 50% of his estate. That's when I consulted my lawyer. I won't mention his name, but let's just say he's one of the most intimidating people I know due to his intelligence. He's a renowned divorce and marital dispute lawyer, known for his sharp mind and cunning tactics, boasting a near-perfect success rate. That's when I dove into the world of marital property rights. Later, I found out Melissa had sought his services, but she didn't have the funds to hire him. He doesn't come cheap, but I decided to invest my savings for a more secure outcome. That's when I discovered something disheartening. Turns out, Melissa had embraced this new faith purely for financial gain, as she was floundering in her decision-making, and was hell-bent on claiming everything in Richard's will. While I had a solid ground regarding the assets as it was clearly stated she would inherit everything, my lawyer spotted a loophole: infidelity. He argued that due to the breach of marital vows and the absence of prenuptial agreements, the assets should be divided fairly. So we strategized to ensure Melissa wouldn't have a shot at winning. You should have seen her expression when the verdict was announced. She was as red as a beetroot, seemingly regretting her actions. It's been a few weeks since then, and the outcome has left me astounded by its sheer magnitude. Melissa lost everything in a flash. How? I'm clueless. My lawyer was stunned at how poorly she managed her sudden wealth, and I felt like I had narrowly escaped a disaster by parting ways with her. Naturally, we discussed divorce right after the asset division, which meant that once we were legally separated, she couldn't stake a claim on my share. I won't deny that my time in Colombia was incredible, but returning home with a hefty bank balance feels even better. These days, no one interacts with Melissa, and her religious friends only converse with her out of courtesy, leaving me with a profound realization that karma does indeed catch up with those who wrong you.